March 20, 1996. Britain is about to learn that one of its most familiar foods may carry a fatal secret. For years, TV viewers have watched cattle stagger, collapse, and kick at empty air. The illness has a frightening nickname, mad cow disease. Officials have repeatedly tried to calm the public. Then, in Parliament, the government announces that a new and deadly human brain disease is most likely connected to exposure to infected cattle. Within hours, beef is no longer just dinner. It is a question. Parents wonder what went into school lunches. Shoppers stare at meat counters. Export markets close. Behind the panic is a fact so disturbing that it sounds invented. An industrial food system had been feeding rendered animal remains back to cattle. A herbivore had been pulled into a manufactured loop, and an abnormal protein called a prion had moved through it. The crisis did not begin with one evil farmer or one contaminated steak. It came from a chain built over centuries to make beef cheaper, faster, more uniform, and more distant from the animal itself. To understand how that chain became possible, we have to go back more than 10,000 years before ranches, railways, refrigerators, or hamburgers, when cattle were not primarily meat. They were walking wealth. The animal standing behind every steak was once the aurochs, taller, leaner, and far more dangerous than most modern cattle. A large bull could rise above a person's shoulders, armed with long forward-curving horns. Neolithic hunters knew its power before herders learned to control it. Bones and ritual deposits suggest that wild cattle were not merely prey. They were symbols of strength, danger, and communal feasting. Genetic and archaeological evidence points to two major domestication histories. Humpless taurine cattle emerged from managed aurochs in the Fertile Crescent roughly 10,500 years ago. About 2,000 years later, humped Indocene cattle, usually called zebu, were domesticated in South Asia in or near the Indus Valley. Those lineages later mixed as people traded, migrated, and adapted herds to new climates. Taurine cattle spread with farmers into Europe. Zebu cattle carried heat tolerance and resilience across much of tropical Asia and through later mixing into Africa and beyond. But domestication did not instantly create a world of beef eaters. Cattle reproduce slowly, require land, and represent years of stored labor. Killing a healthy animal could destroy tomorrow's milk, traction, calves, hides, and manure for one large meal today. A living ox could pull a plough through hard soil, drag a cart, move grain, and extend the amount of land a family could cultivate. A cow could turn grasses. People could not digest into milk. Dung fertilized fields, fueled fires, and plastered walls. Horn became tools. Hide became leather. Only at the end, or on a rare ceremonial occasion, did the animal become meat. That is why cattle became more than livestock. They became a form of savings that could breathe, reproduce, walk to market, and survive where coins had little meaning. The English word cattle preserves this memory. It entered English through an Anglo-French word for property or wealth, and shares a medieval linguistic ancestry with capital. Long before beef was sold by weight in plastic trays, wealth could literally be counted by the head. Early states understood the equation. Cattle appeared in tribute lists, temple offerings, marriage payments, and royal herds. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, scribes counted animals because rulers could tax them, sacrifice them, redistribute their meat, or put their strength to work. Public slaughter turned stored wealth into political theatre. The ruler or temple did not merely feed a crowd. It demonstrated the power to destroy something valuable and then share it. For ordinary people, however, beef was often occasional, seasonal, or the flesh of an animal that had already spent years working. That meat could be old and tough, better suited to boiling, stewing, salting, or drying than to the tender steak imagined today. Raising cattle, mainly to be slaughtered young, required abundant pasture, reliable markets, and customers rich enough to pay for lost labor. Beef, in other words, had to be separated from the many other things a cow could do. Even language hints at that separation. Cow and ox came through Old English, while beef arrived through Anglo-French. A famous story claims that English-speaking peasants tended the cow while French-speaking nobles ate the beef. Real linguistic history is messier than that neat class fable, but the split is still revealing. The living animal and the food on the table acquired different names. The first disappearance had begun. Once carved, cooked, and renamed, the cow became beef. For centuries. Preservation limited how far that beef could travel. Fresh meat spoiled quickly. Salted beef survived voyages, fed garrisons, and provisioned ships. But salt changed its taste and texture. Cattle, therefore, often walked to consumers on their own hooves. Herds moved toward towns, armies, and seasonal fairs. The animal was its own transport and its own temporary storage system that worked until cities and empires demanded more meat than nearby land could provide. After 1492, European colonization carried Old World cattle into the Americas, where there had been bison, but no domesticated cattle. Spanish herds multiplied first in the Caribbean and then across Mexico and the continental mainland. Cattle occupied grasslands, damaged some indigenous fields, and helped colonizers turn contested territory into ranch property. Hides and tallow could be worth as much as or more than the meat. A roaming herd marked a claim. This land was now being measured, branded, and brought into an imperial economy. In many colonies, that economy rested on coerced indigenous labor and enslaved African labor, as well as free ranch workers. People drove animals, cured hides, rendered fat, salted meat, and supplied plantations, mines, forts, and ports. Feral cattle also became a resource beyond direct colonial control, hunted and traded by communities that adapted the newcomers to their own needs. Cattle were therefore not just instruments of empire. They were contested animals whose ownership, movement, and meaning changed from one frontier to another. But wherever herds expanded, they made land more valuable to outsiders who claimed the right to fence, tax, and sell it. Yet ranching culture in the Americas was never simply imported intact from Spain. It was remade by Mexican, indigenous, African, and mixed ancestry workers. The vaquero developed extraordinary skills for handling cattle across vast, dry landscapes. The lariat, chaps, corral, rodeo, and even the word buckaroo preserved that Spanish and Mexican inheritance, long before Hollywood created the white American cowboy. Vaqueros had already built the craft. After the United States Civil War, the equation changed again. Texas held millions of longhorn cattle, while growing eastern cities were willing to pay much higher prices for beef. The problem was distance. Cowboys drove herds north to rail towns in Kansas, where cattle could be loaded for Chicago and other urban markets. These crews were more diverse than the later legend. Mexican vaqueros, black cowboys, indigenous riders, immigrants, and white laborers all worked the trails. The cattle drive looked like freedom in paintings, but it depended on conquest and infrastructure. Commercial hunters, railroads, federal policy, and military campaigns helped devastate the great bison herds and force Plains peoples onto reservations. Domestic cattle moved into a landscape from which both bison and indigenous control had been violently stripped. Then barbed wire divided the open range. The cowboy did not vanish, but the business changed from moving animals across shared grass to controlling land, breeding, fences, water, and access to rail. The railway made a national beef market possible, but at first it carried the entire animal. Live cattle lost weight in transit, required feed and water, and sometimes arrived injured. Every city still needed slaughterhouses. What industrialists wanted was to send only the valuable carcass. The obstacle was temperature. In the late 1870s, Chicago meatpacker Gustavus Swift helped turn the refrigerated rail car into a working business system. Rail companies resisted. They had invested in livestock cars, and chilled meat demanded unfamiliar handling. Swift arranged cars, icing stations, branch houses, and sales networks that kept dressed beef cold from the packing plant to distant consumers. The crucial invention was not one magic box. It was an unbroken chain of cold. That chain shifted power. Local butchers could no longer control the whole journey from live animal to customer. Giant Chicago firms bought cattle, slaughtered them centrally, divided the carcasses, and shipped branded meat across the country. At the Union Stockyard, opened in 1865, animals arrived by the thousands into a landscape of pens, smoke, blood, steam, whistles, and rails. A creature that had taken years to raise could move through the plant in minutes. The packing house refined what might be called a disassembly line. Instead of one craft butcher completing an animal, workers repeated a single cut as carcasses moved past. Speed reduced costs. It also made labor exhausting and dangerous. Packers turned hides into leather, fat into soap and food products, bones into fertilizer or glue, and scraps into saleable goods. Profit came from making every part legible to the factory, but efficiency created new forms of invisibility. Consumers no longer knew the person who raised or slaughtered their meat. Workers and sanitary conditions disappeared behind a label. In 1906, Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle tried to expose the lives of exploited packing house laborers. Readers were horrified by its descriptions of meat production. Public outrage and government investigation helped push the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drugs Act into law. Sinclair aimed at working conditions. the public reacted through its stomach. Rail refrigeration conquered a continent. Refrigerated ships then redrew the world. Experiments in the late 1870s proved that frozen meat from the southern hemisphere could survive an ocean voyage. In 1882, the Dunedin delivered a commercially successful cargo of frozen meat from New Zealand to Britain. Soon cold stores, freezing works, ports, and insulated ships linked Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Uruguay, and other producing regions to European tables. Now a steer could graze beneath a southern sky and be eaten in a northern industrial city months later. The Argentine pampas became one of the iconic landscapes of this new trade. The gaucho remained its romantic figure, but behind him grew railways, foreign investment, slaughterhouses, cold stores, and export companies. Refrigeration did more than prevent decay. It detached meat from place. Distance became a cost hidden inside machinery that altered class as well as geography. Imported frozen and chilled meat helped put more beef within reach of urban households that could not afford the best local cuts. But consumers often distrusted meat that had crossed an ocean, and local producers fought it as unfair competition. Labels, grades, inspections, and advertising were meant to resolve a new anxiety. If buyers could no longer judge the living animal or know the butcher, they had to trust a system. Modern beef was becoming abundant at the very moment its origins became harder to verify. During the 20th century, the animal disappeared even further. Trucks replaced many rail journeys. Breeders selected cattle for growth and carcass traits. Feedlots concentrated animals near grain and packing plants, allowing cattle to gain weight on energy-dense rations before slaughter. Supermarkets sold standardized cuts beneath bright lights. Home refrigerators made fresh beef routine instead of a purchase that had to be cooked immediately. Then the hamburger solved beef's final problem, irregularity. Grinding could combine trimmings and less celebrated cuts into a product with the same shape, portion, and cooking time. The origin of the hamburger is disputed, but its industrial destiny is clear. In 1948, the McDonald brothers simplified their California restaurant around a 15-cent hamburger and a rapid production system. Franchising, frozen patties, highways, and drive-through windows turned beef into food designed for motion. A steak still suggested an animal. A hamburger could become an identical disc beneath sauce, cheese, and a branded wrapper. It crossed borders easily because the experience could be repeated. Same diameter, same grill time, same promise. Beef became a symbol of post-war abundance, convenience, and modernity. Rising incomes carried that aspiration into new markets. The global beef empire no longer needed cattle drives. It needed feed contracts, genetics, refrigeration, advertising, and logistics software. And then the hidden chain returned to public view. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy was first identified in Britain in 1986. Scientists came to understand that a misfolded protein, a prion, was damaging cattle brains. The outbreak had been amplified when contaminated meat and bone meal was fed to young cattle. Rendering had transformed animal tissue into an anonymous protein input. The feed bag concealed what the cow was consuming. At the epidemic's peak in 1993, Britain recorded nearly 1,000 new cattle cases a week. The 1996 announcement connected BSE to a new human illness, variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. The number of human cases remained small compared with the scale of the fear, but the disease was incurable and fatal. The shock came from what it revealed. A system built to use every scrap had crossed a biological boundary. Parts of cattle had been rendered, mixed, sold, and returned to cattle, allowing the risk to circulate before anyone could see it. Feed bans, the removal of high-risk tissues, testing, surveillance, and mass control measures eventually made classical BSE extremely rare. But public trust did not recover through reassurance alone. It required traceability, knowing where an animal was born, what it ate, where it moved, and how its body entered the food chain. The cow had to become visible again. Today, beef remains both nourishment and argument. It supplies high-quality protein, iron, vitamin B12, income, identity, and pleasure. It anchors cuisines from Korean barbecue and Nigerian suya to Argentina sardo and American brisket. For pastoral communities, cattle can convert vegetation from land unsuitable for crops into food and livelihoods. No single production system describes them all, yet the scale has consequences. Cattle produce methane as microbes digest plants in the rumen. Feed, manure, processing, transport, and land use change add more emissions. The Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that cattle raised for meat and milk account for most of livestock's climate footprint. In parts of the Amazon, cleared land commonly becomes pasture, connecting a distant beef market to roads, fire, land speculation, and lost forest. There are ways to reduce that burden: better animal health, improved grazing, shorter production cycles, protected forests, traceable supply chains, methane-reducing feeds, less waste, and diets that treat beef as something valuable rather than invisible. None is a single solution, and different landscapes demand different choices. But the history points to one principle. Cheap beef is never only the price printed on a menu. Other costs can be displaced onto workers, animals, public health, climate, and land. Look at a burger today, and the cow is almost impossible to see. Behind it stand the aurochs, the first herders, the ox at the plough, the colonial ranch, the vaquero, the cowboy, the displaced bison, the Chicago worker, the refrigerated car, the gaucho, the feedlot, the drive-through, and the prion laboratory. Beef did not conquer the world simply because people loved its taste. It conquered the world because an enormous system learned to make the animal disappear. So the next time a steak hits the grill, listen to the sizzle. That sound carries 10,000 years of labor, wealth, conquest, invention, and risk. Which changed beef more? Refrigeration, railways, or fast food? Tell me what you think. And if you want the next Food Empire history story in your headphones, follow the show on Spotify, on YouTube. Like the video and subscribe.